Chairman, my distinguished and all the delegates, dignitaries. Now, let me first start with thanking VSI management organizing this conference for inviting me to speak on my perspectives on an important theme, that's supply of green sugarcane on a long-term basis to meet the growing demand for bioenergy and sugar. So I think this morning you all heard from the keynote speaker and this afternoon from the minister, how important sugarcane is becoming in many countries, including here in China, in India. So let me just start this talk with taking you through some of the global statistics as well as the country-wide statistics to get into the theme of sustainable production of sugarcane for the energy requirements or for the renewable energy market. So this is the trend of sugarcane production globally for the last 6 decades. It was quite impressive. It increased quite reasonably well, in fact quite impressively, until a decade ago, and then it started flattening off. That is what the data shows. From 2010 onwards, the average production, the global sugarcane production is somewhat staying at the same level, going a little bit up and down, which is mainly dictated by the weather events. Now, even this is the global trend. What is more interesting is, if you break it down, this global mean into country-wide performance, most of the production of sugarcane is happening in 3 or 4 countries. So basically, Brazil, India, and China account for almost 65% of the total sugarcane production. In fact, if you add Thailand, it becomes about 70%. So, from a production perspective, global sugarcane production perspective, actually, it is all happening within 4 countries, these 4 major producers, Brazil, India, China, and Thailand. And anything happening in these countries are going to seriously affect the global supply of sugarcane and eventually the sugar as well. So they say that's the situation. And more significantly, what you need to look at here is, in all these 4 countries, the whole production, the 70% of the sugarcane production is done by just 8 varieties. 3 varieties in Brazil, almost half of the Brazil. It's a massive, 10 million production, and 10 million hectares. And then 2 each from India and China, and 1 in Thailand. So effectively, this 8 varieties produces bulk of the sugarcane in this world. That itself is a very risky thing, because it is from a biosecurity perspective. If something happened to one of these major varieties, the production can be really crashed down. And that happened in some countries, even at least in Australia, some time back. So some of these risks need to be managed if we really want to increase the production globally. Now, where are the demand for green cane coming from now? It's essentially the 3 reasons for the renewed impetus producing more sugarcane. One is the growing expansion, the rapid expansion of renewable energy market, which is really very seriously, you can feel it in India. And to some extent also you can see it in Thailand, some Southeast Asian countries, and of course in Brazil. So there is a really big push for renewable energies production from sugarcane. Then at a respectable level, the global demand for sugar is going, even though per capita consumption is slightly declining in the last several years. So it is mainly the industrial demand for sugar is growing. So the sugar market is still really creeping up. Then finally, from a political perspective, I think all the major countries are really pushing hard for decarbonization, and sugarcane is considered to be one of the green crop or green bioenergy crop, and that is also pushing hard on the sugar industries to make it more sugarcane production. Now let us take these demand side one by one, a little more, get into a bit more detail. The first is the demand for sugar. As I said earlier, so this projection is coming from S&P Global Commodity Outlook. They are a very highly respected consulting firm, and they made this projection. And according to their projection, the demand will continue to grow at a reasonable level going forward next 10 to 15 years. And the assumption is again based on the need for sugarcane for the bioenergy sector. In India, it is really, really very evident. From this afternoon, the presentation is more than clear that it is going to be, the government is going to make all efforts to adjust the policy decisions to make it. Here it is energy independence is a national objective, and government is making now E20 as a mandated criteria for fuel from 2025 to 2026, which is a very ambitious target. I'm not sure whether India can produce that much of sugar cane to reach E20 by 2025. But, well, that is, you need to be very ambitious in all these things to get somewhere. Then transportation fuel demand is going to go up almost. This is projected to make it more than double in the next by 2014, because there is going to be an explosion of new automobiles in India. It is going to be predicted to make about 300 million new vehicles by 2040. So these numbers are really underpinning the push behind the policies set by the government to make the Indian sugar industry produce more sugar as well as ethanol. Then what are the options? So, well, there is a market force behind the need for more sugarcane production. But what are the options? How realistic it is to produce a substantial amount of sugarcane to make a dent on the energy market. Energy market is huge. I mean, just take the case of Indian fuel energy market. It's a huge one. If you want to make even some impact on it, the amount of sugarcane need to produce is huge. So where is this sugarcane is going to come from? That is one of the important questions we need to ask. There are only three options. The first is increasing the production area. The second is increasing the productivity, that is yield increase, cane yield or sugar yield or both, and as well as making it more efficient in production on a sustainable way. So these are only the three options. The efficiency and sustainability is coming into fore because the decarbonization target of industry, the government pushing for that element of production, agricultural production. Just take the case of production area. This, the left side panel, the left panel graph is showing the area increase, the production area increase in sugarcane at a global scale. It just like the production, it increased over the last 6 decades very well, and again plateau. And if you break it down, the country-wide increase. The right side panel give you the details about the country-wide expansion of sugar production. Actually, most of the increase in sugar production is accounted for by the expansion of sugar area in two countries, the Brazil and India. Most other major producers, the so-called major producers, really the area of production didn't much happen. So essentially, the production increase is explained by the really rapid increase in the production area in Brazil, and that is perhaps the underlying reason for making Brazil so successful in bioenergy production. And in India, it was gradually increasing over the last 3-4 decades. However, the third producer, the biggest producer, China, it went the other way. In fact, in the last decade, we lost almost 1/3 of the Chinese sugarcane production. It was about 1.8 million hectares in 2011, and now it is about 1.1 hectares. A substantial amount of production area actually declined. There is a reason for that. The most of these, the lost area has gone for higher value agricultural production, mainly for citrus production and vegetable production. So in China, the Chinese sugar industry actually shrunk by 1/3 in the last 10 years. So when you look at the trend in most of the countries, barring these two major producers, and what happened in China, the prospect of expansion of sugar area to increase the sugar production is possibly minimal. Now, let us check the case for sugar yield. Like the area, the production increased. It's quite impressively around 315% over the last 6 decades. But the cane yield improvement was only about 40% during that period, which is not that impressive. But it is still a reasonable rate of increase in sugar production, sugar yield improvement, genetic yield improvement. Well, that also, like what happened in the production area, again, the production rate, the biggest improvements happened in Brazil and India. Now, I just mentioned earlier that the rate of improvement of sugarcane is relatively around just 40% over the 6 decades period. But when you compare that rate of increase, even though it is quite decent for a crop of sugar, the crop with an annual cycle and vegetative crop, when you compare it with other major crops, particularly cereals, and it's really quite low. Even sugar beet in the last 20-25 years made a very impressive improvement in production. It's increased by 160% over the last six years. So considering the improvement of rate of genetic improvement of other crops, sugarcane is actually not doing really well. So if that is the trend, can we expect to increase the sugar production to such a large area required for bioenergy production by relying on increasing the cane yield, which I doubt probably may not be a very wise assumption. However, when you consider the productivity gain on a countrywide in the last 6 decades, except the front runners, United States and Australia, where the productivity was actually reached quite high in the 80 to 90 or even 100 tons per hectare by 1960 and stayed on as it is even now, somewhat in the same range. But the other major players really picked up fast over the last 4 decades, in the 1960s by 2000, but again reached to this level and staying on. This is the trend which is worrying me now. If this is the case, everyone is going to stay on the same place, will the yield improvement is a viable option to make a quantum leap in sugarcane production for the market demand going forward for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. So if you look at the next slide, breaking it down into the productivity trend of sugarcane yield in different countries, for example, Australia, Brazil, China, India, and Thailand, it's all staying flat. Remember, during this period, hundreds of varieties were released, and still it really didn't make any difference. So can we expect a real big quantum jump in productivity in the next 10 years if this is the historic trend of cane yield? And if you look at the sugar production, sugar yield, it is worse. It stayed on for a long time, somewhat in the like 13, 14% on stayed on. It really didn't change much. However, then one would wonder that, is there any possibility at all to make a big change? Is the varieties which we produce now already achieved the maximum productivity yield ceiling, and that is it what we are going to get? But the data, some of the data which is I'm showing in this slide is proving otherwise. It is not actually true. For example, here in India, 40238, which is considered to be a wonder cane, one of the very rare exception, which produced up to 327 million tons per hectare in a commercial setting. And multiple varieties produce around 250 tons per hectare in here in Maharashtra and also in Queensland in Australia. So there are the same varieties which we are now currently growing. Some of them really produce very high yield in some farms under commercial settings. That is suggesting that it is actually, the yield potential is still very high, and there is something beyond the genetic block is really stopping the productivity gain achieving in a commercial production. So similar high yielding examples are existing in China, Thailand, and in fact, the theoretical estimation of sugar yield for sugarcane is estimated to be around 380 tons per hectare. So if everything, all the production conditions are ideal, with no water stress restrictions or diseases or anything, you can produce up to 381 tons per hectare with the existing genetics. That means these data is telling that if we continue to grow or continue to produce varieties and grow them the way which we are doing, really we can't expect a big quantum shift in productivity in the coming future. So we may need to do something more differently. Just by doing the same thing again and again will not take us going forward. The current system of selection, just do the trials, select for yield or select for sugar alone or fiber or some other traits alone is not going to take us far. We need to think a little more differently. Something like what the grain industry is doing. We may need to go for more production constrained, breeding for overcoming the production constraints in the farming systems. So that is probably one of the way the breeding program need to look at it. So what is expected in the future is, and what is currently limiting the productivities are the extreme weather events and also really worsening the land degradation, like soil acidification, in the weather front, drought, lethal heat stress, flooding, etc. So unless we really started thinking along that line how the grain breeding programs are heading towards, and which they are making real big strides in genetic improvement, which we have seen the percentages here in my previous slide. So we probably, from a sugarcane breeding perspective, we may have to think a bit more differently in terms of targeting breedings and selection. I will just take you through two examples before finishing this presentation. The first is a climate change or weather extreme related situation, drought, which is becoming more and more regular. I'm just showing you data, the projections for India. India and Pakistan are considered to be the two first countries going to be most severely affected by the climate change effect. And what is projected is the extreme drought events are expected to increase quite significantly, even a very short term, by 2030 in India. So are we really gearing towards, our breeding programs are really gearing towards making varieties more resilient to the future weather patterns or future climatic conditions? Another example in the case of land degradation. Here I'm drawing an example from China. So this is the change in soil, just taking one parameter, change in soil pH in 1980 versus 2023, so I think 2020. Within the last 40 years, so much of land has been, the pH, soil pH has been changed more towards acidic, almost about 2 points acidic. In currently, nearly 60% of the farm soil, nearly 50% of the farms with the soil having 3 to 4 pH. So severe acidity is a major problem, limiting the overall productivity of the Chinese production area in Guangxi. Why? Because intensive farming, monoculture, there is no fallow period, too much of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. The average is about 600 kilograms per hectare, which ranging from 345 to 1,300 kilogram nitrogen per hectare. So effectively, we are putting too much of input to destroy the production. So unless we are really prepared to tackle the cases, tackle the future scenarios going to be witnessed by the sugarcane industry, it's going to be very, very hard. Do we have a few more minutes? Do we have a few more? Quickly. So I'll just take what we could do to tackle these problems just by showing one example of making varieties drought resilient. This example, I'm drawing it from the Australian breeding program, where I was involved in at that time. Improving drought tolerance and water use efficiency in sugarcane. So using the actual breeding materials coming from the Australian breeding program. So we initiated a program about 12, 14 years ago, a major program on identifying traits potentially suitable for using as a selection target for variety as clone selection in the breeding. So started with a massive selection program using the genetic material available at that time, including parental lines and breeding lines. The trouble is, when you look at the drought tolerance literature, there are nearly 100 different traits were published as excellent traits for improving drought tolerance. But when we selected some of them and started investigating in the field condition, most of them are useless, absolutely useless for using as a selection criteria for actual breeding program. Why? Because most of the traits don't fit into these minimum characteristics needed to be successful for a breeding program. One is the traits which we are going to select for drought tolerance or any other tolerance limit, the abiotic stress tolerance, they had to have very high genetic variation, must be highly heritable, and in fact the heritability must be more heritable, it should be more heritable than the yield itself, and must be good at diverse production conditions. There shouldn't be any yield penalties if you select for that trait, and it should be allowed out of season selection. So, and must be quick, easy, and inexpensive. So unless you feel these traits, it is really very hard. If a trait is not meeting these criteria, it has very little value for using as a selection trait. Finally, we ended up with two traits, canopy conductance and the canopy temperature. Those two traits proved to be useful for using in the real breeding selection condition as the traits for identifying clones better resilient to water deficit and water insufficiency. So there will be huge genetic variability for the material we screened and for the canopy conductance, and that canopy conductance was very closely related with the photosynthesis, so that means the biomass production. It was very closely genetically correlated with the biomass production. and which was under both drought and irrigated and semi-irrigated condition, showed very high genetic correlation as well. So all these, the characteristics are turned out to be, these two traits turned out to be a very suitable fit for selection. And finally, using the aerial phenomics, we could actually easily screen large populations of breeding material, breeding trials, breeding clones, tens of thousands of breeding clones in a relatively short period of time. And showed very huge, using this phenomic system, and it showed very large variation. We can very easily pick up all the variation for these
Prakash, restrict to time.
Two traits. And it is now it is being implemented in the breeding program and currently undergoing in actual selection program in Australia. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.